Welcome to the Grateful American Radio Show, hosted by author and publisher David Bruce Smith. What did George Washington do that you might not know about? What did Abe Lincoln know that could change the way you think about the Civil War? You'll learn about all that and more on this special show designed to restore excitement in American history. Let's get started. Welcome to David Bruce Smith's Grateful American series on the Incandescent Radio Network. David's series is an interactive multimedia program designed to restore enthusiasm in American history for children and grown-ups too. Your host for the show are author and publisher David Bruce Smith, creator of the Grateful American series, and myself, Hope Katz-Gibbs, creator of the Incandescent Radio Network. Hello, David. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Hope. It's great to be here.
I'm really excited to be here, too. We are here at Mount Vernon, George Washington's home in Northern Virginia, with Doug Bradburn, founding director of the Fred W. Smith National Library. And this place is unbelievable. We are in the stacks with Martha Washington's papers, sitting adjacent to a room next to George Washington's actual books. They're just feet away. It's incredible. But before we launch into our Q&A, we want to tell our listeners a little bit about Doug. Before becoming the founding director of the library, he was a professor and director of graduate studies in the history department at Binghamton University. He taught college-level courses at a variety of institutions, held 2 year-long fellowships, earned a PhD in history from the University of Chicago, and has his BA in history and economics from the University of Virginia. Doug is a specialist in the history of the American Revolution and the founding of the United States, which he gave us a tour before, and that will so come through in our Q&A. He's also published numerous articles and book chapters on topics related to the great problems of the Revolutionary Age. His book, The Citizenship Revolution, Politics and the Creation of the American Union, 1774 to 1804, represents a thorough reconsideration of the meaning of the founding of the nation from the perspective of the political fights over the meaning of individual rights and states' rights within a changing federal union. This is just going to be such an interesting discussion, so let's get started. Welcome to the show, Doug. We're thrilled to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted that you asked me to be on the program.
Yes, and we're thrilled to be here at Mount Vernon. So how did you personally develop a passion for American history?
I believe that I came to love American history through a real interest in storytelling and in stories. From an early age, I wanted to be a writer, and I was more attracted to stories of our past than in fiction. So that was really, I think, the genesis of my interest. On the other hand, my father was also very interested in history, and I think that has a big impact on people. When they see their parents reading history or taking you to historical sites, and these things definitely spurred my interest as well.
And you told us earlier you grew up in Wisconsin and moved here when you were about 10. How did that change your perspective on history?
I think that moving from Wisconsin, where the history wasn't as close to Virginia, the history of the founding of the United States and the history of America was told in a different way in Wisconsin. So it was told as the French explorers, and it was told, in the traditional ways. But in Virginia, particularly in Williamsburg, Virginia, where I grew up, it's sort of all around you, you know, and that ability to go to Jamestown and go to colonial Williamsburg and see the houses, and I mean, that was a transformative experience for what was probably a strong interest in history to what would become a lifetime passion for, understanding the past.
And since we're focused on getting kids passionate about it, we're really curious to hear how we can help kids do that even more.
But let me can I ask you a question? This job is it's a relocation and a slightly different concentration for you. What was it that lured you to Mount Vernon, and how can you use the house to entice visitors, especially kids?
Well, the job was appealing to me because of the ability to speak to multiple audiences about the importance of the past. So as a professor at a university, It's great. You get to interact with a lot of college students, and you get to teach the survey class, and I got to mentor a lot of graduate students, people who would themselves become teachers, both at the college level and at the high school level. But I felt more and more that I wanted to have a direct communication with different publics. So from different school-age children, as well as the general public, as well as leaders in military affairs and politics. And that's one of the things this new presidential library really gives you an opportunity to do. So not only can you stimulate scholarship and encourage it through our fellowship programs and our academic programs, but then you can try to figure out imaginative ways to distribute it to the interest levels of different people. So when we get to kids, when we talk about K through 12, that is a great challenge. They all learn in different ways. But what we can do at this institution now is aggressively court them and create materials for them that are appealing to them. But finally, with kids, when it comes to the house itself, getting them to Mount Vernon is half the battle. I mean, if you get them here, I think just being here is a tremendous way to experience the estate and the past. I have two sons. I have a son who's 10 years old and a son who's 8 years old, and they think Mount Vernon is the coolest place ever because they get to run around and see everything. Now, every visitor isn't going to have the access that my children have, so they can kind of experience it over time, much in the way that I consumed Colonial Williamsburg. But I think just for the average school kid that can come out here and can go to the museum and go to the house and really get a sense that this man, George Washington, was a real person and that the estate is a real thing, allows them to connect themselves to the past in an exciting way.
So how do you make George Washington a real person? I always felt that Abraham Lincoln was beloved and George Washington was admired. George Washington is a little unreachable in history. He doesn't quite seem as human as Lincoln. So how do you deal with that?
It's a great challenge, and I think you're right. I mean, Washington himself was he was called the father of his country before the American Revolution was over, and he would have a whole nother career after that as the first president, as the president of the Constitutional Convention. So the greatness of Washington is so tremendously overwhelming at times that it's just very difficult to find the man beneath the icon. I mean, he's on the dollar bill, he's in your pocket on a quarter. But his monument, unlike the Lincoln Memorial, is an obelisk. It's an abstract obelisk. It's not a man sitting in a chair with his words around him. And so the story of Washington needs to be told in a way that explains that he's a human being, a man who made failures, who struggled through adversity, who wasn't perfect at all. And I think some of those stories for kids would be really eye-opening, particularly Washington's really youthful emergence as a leader in Virginia. I was telling you all earlier about his trip out west when he's there to deliver this message to the French in the Ohio Valley. And it's an extraordinary tale of adventure and hardship. And it's a tale I think that not many people know. So there are ways I think that you can try to get people to see a new Washington. But I think you're right, David. I think the challenge is the very ubiquity of Washington. It makes him a little less, less easy for people to get at.
The other thing is he is not at all defined by tragedy. Lincoln was assassinated. Jefferson was a widower. There's nothing that I can think of that is, I mean, you don't hear of anything that's tragic.
But that's his youth. I mean, his father dies, remember, when he's 11 years old.
Right.
His brother Lawrence then, his half-brother Lawrence, who was a mentor to him and someone who could help him in society, dies also when he's very young, still in his teens. So he does have to sort of make his way. He has responsibility cast upon him at a very early age. And in fact, so the house he grew up in, Ferry Farm in Fredericksburg, is a property that ultimately he sells, and it's a farmable piece of Virginia property that he sells, which is very rare for Washington. And in some ways, you could see that as himself sort of distancing what was a very painful difficult period in his life. He had a young sister. The only Washington buried at Ferry Farm died in infancy there as well. And when Washington went back to take a survey of the property before he was going to put it on the market, he started the survey from the tombstone of that little girl. He could have started it from anywhere. He could have started it from the house or from a fence post or anything, but he started it from that tomb marker and then did a personal survey that he kept as his own. It didn't become a part of the official record. This was a private survey that he made for himself. So you can be a psychologist, I guess, and try to figure out that story, but so that story is not, it's a private one that isn't told about Washington. It isn't the public assassination. It isn't the early widowerhood. So I think you're right, but he also kind of lives through adversity in many different ways. His failure at Fort Necessity, where he's captured, which spurs and begins the French and Indian War, is a great it's a great blunder, and it could have been the ruin of him, but he's able to sort of learn from it. The same in the American Revolution itself. His loss at New York and Manhattan ultimately ends up with him winning at Yorktown. So he has those failures. He just overcomes them within his own life, in some ways in such a dramatic fashion that, again, it leads to this sort of mythos of this, of this untouchable man. So
these facts, which are sort of by the way facts, because most people don't know them. He also had a very difficult mother. If those were made more well known, he becomes human, and in a way more attractive, at least to kids. Is that right?
I think so. I mean, it's always a challenge when you have a life that's so full. He has such a big life. I mean, the first president of a brand new Republican system of government in North America, the leader of this tremendous rebellion that nobody could possibly believe was going to succeed at the time they began it. A French and Indian War officer, which was itself a great war, I mean, who has time to tell all these stories to kids, even within a classroom, and then to get at the human side. So I think the greatness of his life, it makes it very difficult to get across, without spending a lot of time, the different nooks and crannies, the by-the-ways, the textures that make him come to be somebody we can love as well as admire.
Fate seemed to play a big, which I didn't realize. And I think that what kids and people who learn from their hearts, you had said earlier, you learn through your head or you learn through your heart. And some people who learn through their hearts, these facts just, pass through. They don't stick to you. Yeah. But you were talking about how he was in battle, that first battle, and the person, his boss died. Mm-hmm. Tell that story, if you would. Okay, so this is at
well, there's a couple of different stories in which that could apply. One of the most famous is actually called the Braddock's March, with Edward Braddock is at the head of a command of British soldiers as well as provincial soldiers, Virginia soldiers. Washington is helping out as a volunteer aide-de-camp. Washington has this reputation as an expert on the West. Braddock's job is to march from Alexandria, essentially, to Fort Duquesne, which is where Pittsburgh is, and try to destroy it, because that fort is allowing the French to wreak all sorts of havoc on the frontiers of British America. And they march out, and Braddock marches, kind of blunders into an ambush, and there's all sorts of chaos. Many people are killed. Braddock is shot and dies, and Washington has 4 bullet holes in his jacket and has multiple horses shot out from under him, but he doesn't have a scratch. He's the only officer that's unwounded at this battle, at this tremendous loss, that Washington then is helpful in sort of retreating in such a way that it saves it from being an absolute disaster. I mean, it was a disaster, but it could have been even worse without Washington's behavior that day. So he does, there's a certain serendipity to his life. There's a certain luck that has to come into play. He is recognized early on by people who say that he's been preserved so Providence can have him do something great for his country. This is during the 7 Years' War. This is before the Revolution. People are writing about him in that fashion. And when he looks back at his life before he becomes president in the Constitutional Convention, he remarks that Providence has played a role. I mean, he has also that sense that there's some destiny, some fate that is at play here.
So interesting.
So let's just get back to humanizing George Washington.
That's right. The way to humanize him is not to talk about destiny.
I don't know.
No, but there is a certain parallelism too. He did not have a very good mother, but he had a great wife.
That's right.
And I do not believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that there is much written about him as Martha's husband. He's the president, he's the commander-in-chief, he's the father of the country, but he's not perceived generally as Martha's husband.
Absolutely, I think you're right.
And is that something that Mount Vernon will take on to? I mean, it's a role it's an important role because she influences him probably more than most people realize, and vice versa.
I think that you're absolutely right. I think that is a challenge always to give that side of the story because Martha's story is more difficult to get at. Her letters to Washington and his letters to her were destroyed at her death, or destroyed before her death. So we know very little about their personal interactions. But when it comes to the story itself, I mean, clearly she's influential. She provides him with a great estate when they marry, but she's there for him his whole life. She's with him throughout the American Revolutionary War. She's at Valley Forge.
Right.
She's supporting him in a way through these very difficult times of loss and adversity. He often talks about wanting to be with Martha at Mount Vernon. That's where he wants to be. He's out here doing public service because he feels like he's called, and he has to maintain his own personal honor, but because it's the right thing to do. But what he really wants is to be back at Mount Vernon with Martha. And so interpreting him as the husband of Martha Washington would be a great way to emphasize her role as, the great matron of Mount Vernon, of the estate itself, the manager of the estate, a manager of his affairs, a helpmate, a counselor, an advisor, and a lover, obviously, that, it was crucial to him to be the man he was. So the old adage, behind every great man is a great woman, I think in this case really applies. And I think there's a great love story there that's really hard to tell without embellishing because they destroyed the evidence of it.
And talk a little bit about the letters and the fact that she destroyed them. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so she destroyed their private correspondence with each other, and so there's very little that exists between them. There is a letter that we have here at Mount Vernon. It's in this room somewhere, which he wrote in 1775, in June of 1775. He's just become the commander-in-chief of this new rebel army. He's about to go commit treason. He's about to march off to Boston and take control of these troops. And he's in a room full of people, and he has very little time, and he says, I'm surrounded by people, but I just wanted to to write to you, and let you know that I retain for you an unalterable affection, which neither time nor distance can change.
So beautiful.
It's a beautiful sentiment, and he couldn't go to the Hallmark store and pick that up. He had to come up with it with people looking over his shoulder, so it really does speak to, I think, a depth of feeling and affection between them that you really just wish you had that body of letters that no doubt was of great importance to them both.
You also talked a little bit, we were chatting before, about Washington as an entrepreneur. And that's something else I didn't realize. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Right. One of the things I think that would be appealing to contemporary Americans, parents as well as their children, about all the founders, but also about Washington in particular, is their belief that things could be improved, that you didn't have to be stuck with inheriting the way things were done and just following things by example. You could improve them. You could try to make things more efficient. You could try to make things more just. And that's really what the Enlightenment ethos that they aspired to was all about. It was how do you understand nature better so that you can create products that are helpful to mankind. He's doing this in his estate. He's trying to find better ways to grow his crops. He's innovating as a businessman does to try to make money, but also because he believes that by showing proper practices of agriculture, you can show proper morality. So the vision of improvement was very much tied into a sense of what they're trying to do with creating this country and then improving their own affairs. So when it comes down to actual practical innovations that Washington's engaged in, he's a very early enterpriser in selling flour, finely found ground flour, to southern Spain and Portugal, when Virginia had been dominated by tobacco monoculture since the middle of the 17th century. He's really a leader there to try to find a new product and a new market. He's a great fisherman. He has a shad fishery on the Potomac, which is quite successful. He has, at the end of his life, a distillery. At his grist mill, he puts into practice an innovative way to grind flour that receives the 3rd copyright of the Patent Office of the United States of America. So here he is signing the patent as president and then saying, oh, well, this looks like a really good idea. I should put this in my grist mill. That system, the Oliver Evans system, grinding system, becomes very popular amongst agricultural improvers. Jefferson puts in the Oliver Evans system in 1808 or 1806, so a decade and a half after Washington has put it in here. So Washington really is sort of at the cutting edge of that innovation. And in fact, when you look at his first State of the Union address to the country, one of the things he calls for is a Copyright Act and weights and measures stability so that you can encourage inventors and improvers to try to make society better, and what they would call useful inventions. They're useful to people. So that entrepreneurship is very much a part of the whole ethos of the founding of the country. We don't want entrepreneurship always to be so narrowly understood, but really it should be thought of as an innovative, a broadly innovative vision.
Right. Makes perfect sense.
So let me ask you, why do you think kids don't know much about history? Do they not care, or do you think it's the educational system is amiss?
Well, I think it's challenging, to say. Kids usually, I think, are interested in things that society is interested in more generally, and we live in a culture that is a celebrity culture that emphasizes some very fleeting things, and the past is not something that's celebrated in this country as it is in many others. It's seen as a heritage that everyone can draw upon. Part of that is the strength of our country. Its diversity leads it to have lots of stories, which makes sense for people to find their place in the world. And so that challenge to find a unifying narrative has been there from the beginning, from Washington's era itself. And teachers in the classroom are confronted with the needs of different regions and different ethnic backgrounds and different stories to try to get across. So I think there's a constraint and a challenge there, to try to find one unifying national historical standard that everybody can rally around. And so I think that's part of it. I think that there's a lot of great fun things for kids to do that aren't reading history. I mean, there's all kinds of video game technology. There's more information coming at them all the time. And so they have a broader range of interests to draw upon than I certainly had as a child, and that many children in the past, certainly didn't have this kind of bouquet of options, of entertainment options.
But these tests, these standardized tests, which are so big, do you think the unimpressive scores are because the kids don't know, or the kids are not being taught?
I think not being an expert on the standardized tests, and I think that the children aren't getting materials that are bringing history alive to them. They're not being challenged in a way. They're not being approached where they're at. They're getting things in an old-fashioned way sometimes, and with stories that aren't compelling, that don't allow them to get the most out of it. And teachers are constrained at times by tests and limits on what they can do in the classroom that doesn't allow them to spend a lot of time on a topic like the American Revolution. So for instance, unless you're in an AP history class in Florida, the American history you're learning begins at the Civil War. So you're not getting any history before the Civil War in high school in many parts of this country. So there's a challenge for someone who's interested in telling the story of the founding and the revolution in George Washington to find innovative ways to get that material into the hands of kids. I mean, some of it means you got to go to where they're at. You might need to develop some interactive video gaming technologies. You might have to try to put things, in very popular forms to get them to take that first bite of the pie, so to speak, that will get them stimulated about history in other ways. So the constraints placed on teachers by institutions that are calling for rigorous testing are sometimes the challenge. And I think that we're trying to give our students a lot of different things. So history sometimes is mixed in with social studies, and it's mixed in with English language arts, and that can be great. A great teacher can really make history come alive that way, but it's hard to do.
So if you have kids here,
Which I do.
and yes, which you do,
Yeah.
and they're learning about George Washington and his times,
That's right.
seemingly without limits, innovative limits, what do you do to make it interesting and not a one-time experience, something they'll want to do outside of Mount Vernon or come back to Mount Vernon, or not an isolated experience?
Well, this is a great challenge. I do have two boys, and I've been, so they're not a great test case because their father has been a professor of history, and I've been dragging them to historic sites all over the East Coast and further afar, since they've been born. I mean, so they're getting that. I think the parents play a crucial role, in delivering history and an interest in history and a continuing interest in what you're talking about, something they crave after and they pursue on their own. People love to do what their parents love to do. On the other hand, I think many kids are thinking historically and don't even know it. So if they're into something like baseball or basketball, they're often interested in the history of the great stars that came forward. So it's not that they're against learning about the past. It's about a particular past that's presented to them. But so going to historic sites, having your parents encourage you is crucial, I think, at a young age for you to believe that history is something worth pursuing, in that very kind of tangible way. But it's a challenge, to come up with an easy answer to why, what particular thing, program, et cetera, you can create for students.
It used to be when you came here,
Yeah.
it was like a museum. I mean, there was, by each thing there was text, and
That's
you
right.
went through reading little cards of text. It wasn't all that exciting for most kids unless
right.
you liked history.
That's right.
But now you're doing all these
That's what you need.
all these new things like the forensic,
Yeah, the interactive aspects. You can touch things. That's what kids need. They need to be able to touch things. They need to be able to play a little bit. Getting at them through play is crucial. I think, putting on plays, encouraging your students to dress up as characters. These are all things that get my kids going. My youngest son, Samuel, is constantly in some sort of outfit or another. He's 8 years old. So for Halloween, ask your children to do a historical figure instead of a zombie or something. See if you can spark in them an interest in a historical subject, because they're interested in all kinds of fascinating things. But the past can be fascinating, and they sometimes don't realize that the stories, the story of the founding of the United States is one of the greatest stories in the history of mankind. It's really a tremendously important and fantastic story of, villains and heroes and all types in between, and so they should be able to find something to grasp onto. But that was what I remember from my own childhood was, putting on plays was a lot of fun and dressing up. But the interactivity that's involved in modern museums is crucial.
I found Madame Tussauds was very well. I loved it as a kid, but my children, because you would see these historical figures, they're three-dimensional, and oh, there's Lincoln, there's
That's right.
Washington, there's whoever.
I absolutely agree. I think that the 3D character of seeing them in human scale, imagining yourself as them, that I think is a great appeal to students. So something that can get them, linked in a tangible way. There's other programs you can do at the Mount Vernon, for instance, that we have the resources that we can develop that get students, well, you can get them inspired, right? I mean, education is as much about inspiration as it is about the delivery of the rote facts. And I think that's where, in history, if you can inspire somebody to say, how do you want to have an impact on the world? How do you want to try to, to change things for the better and leave the world a better place than you found it? That's the story of what these founders of the United States were trying to do. And they failed in some ways. But that's what you're for. You're the next generation. It's your chance to carry the mantle forward, to challenge them, to be more than they know they can be by stories of regular people doing extraordinary things. So putting it in a way that inspires them, but then putting fun involved. So you can, we have a number of things in the estate that you mentioned that are interactive. We do things like colonial days where students can come and see colonial games and they can sort of see life in the 18th century. But one of the programs that we're developing in the library is going to be called Becoming George Washington. And this is one where George Washington learned surveying, for instance, both by being a surveyor in the field, but by reading books. So he learned in traditional ways by reading and thinking about it, but he also learned by doing. And so what you can do is you can bring students of a certain age that will really appeal to, where you can have a dynamic, interactive, multimedia presentation about surveying and the history of surveying and why it matters in Washington's life. And then you can get them on the estate actually learning to survey and doing it themselves, which is very tactile. It's fantastic. Or you can have them building a fort, which is what he had to do when he was defending the frontier. He had to design and lay out forts, and you do that by walking it out and laying it out. And so you can teach them about, the character of military leadership, the character of teamwork, and then about the past as well. And so that's one way I think that you can have a learning environment, a student-centered learning environment that really will make it a memorable experience. Now, it might be a one-off in the sense that they do that once, but they'll remember it, and they'll compare other learning experiences to it, and they'll say, why can't we do more like that? Because that is really a way to interact with, the endless, boundless opportunity for fun that kids can always bring, And anytime you get them having to be in charge of things, it's a great way to get them to learn.
And you have a National Treasure interactive experience, too. That was the greatest thing because it brought history to life. And that was one question I want to ask you, sort of at the foundation. Why is it important to learn history, to know what happened before?
Well, we learn about the past to understand the present. We learn about the past is not like you're going into the past to live there. We live in the present. And the past tells us why the world looks the way it looks, why we believe what we believe, who we are, and where we can go. So these stories in the past are not, and particularly in a national past, these stories are not just, fun fantasies, but they can be very instructive tales, that allow us to understand, the choices made before we were here that have impacted our own lives. So there's a basic need to know these stories, just as any child needs to know where they came from. They need to know their parents and how their parents met. And I mean, we all live based on the choices of others that came before us. So, Faulkner, of course, famously says the past isn't just the past; it isn't even past. It is that aspect, I think, to understanding that we're part of a continuity, we're part of something that kids really crave. I mean, they want to be, they want to be part of something. They want to be seen as a part of a community, not just, off on their own, sort of doing their own thing.
And as a jumping off point, I think if we use that as a foundation, then parents and kids can get engaged in that.
There's an organization that says history is important if you want to be able to defend your right and your might. You need to know history.
That's nice. Yeah, I mean, that's a good way to put it. How do you know what you know if you don't know, the past?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everybody uses the past to justify all kinds of things they talk about and their opinions and what they think should happen. They just don't all have a good understanding of the past. I think that the human beings live in a linear way. We're born, we live and we die. We're lived in that in a story arc, and just connecting people to the past can really give their life meaning in a crucial way. If you have a child who's, who doesn't know what they want to do, they're kind of listless, they're wandering around, taking them to an historic site, helping them think about, how they came to be is a really great way to connect them.
Connection.
If you could pick two things you want kids to know about George Washington, what would they be?
Well, that's a great question, because there's a lot of things about George Washington I want, the citizens of this country to know, and the future citizens, and well, I guess kids are citizens too. Well, that might be a good motto. Kids are citizens too. So they have to know that Washington was the first president. They have to know he was the great revolutionary commander and all those things. But what I would want them to know is that Washington never gave up in the face of adversity, that he failed many times in his life, and he learned from those lessons. That the challenges of his early life, early loss of his father, the early loss of his stepbrother, the failures in military campaigns were not things that ground him up. They were things that made him improve himself and strive towards improvement. So that's one big thing I want kids to kind of think about. This person on the dollar bill this is a person who's on the dollar bill because all the difficult things he struggled with, he learned from and he pushed through. So having the courage to kind of work through challenges and not give up is a crucial lesson of Washington's life for children, I think. And the other is that Washington gave up power, that at the crucial moment when he could have become a very powerful figure, that he was willing to walk away from it because he thought it was in the common good. So not the most selfish way to live with an idea that you're trying to do what's right for everybody and not just what's best for yourself and might be in your own interest. These are another lesson, having two boys at home. That is a lesson I really would love people to not only know about Washington, but embrace as a way to live what in the 18th century would have been called a virtuous life, a life in public service.
We learned so much about George Washington today. You are a great ambassador to this beautiful estate of Mount Vernon, and we very much look forward to coming back and talking to you more and to helping you promote all the great stuff that's going here to all of our listeners on David Bruce Smith's Grateful American series. So thank you for your time, Doug.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you, Hope. I really appreciate it. This has been a lot of fun.
Excellent. Be sure to check out Mount Vernon's site at www.mountvernon.org. That's it for today's Grateful American radio show on the Incandescent Radio Network. Next month, we'll be heading to President Lincoln's cottage at Soldiers Home here in D.C., where we'll be interviewing Executive Director Aaron Mast Carlson. So here's to restoring enthusiasm in American history for children and adults, too. We look forward to igniting your passion and to talking to you soon. Thanks so much for your time. You have been listening to the Grateful American Radio Show, hosted by author and publisher David Bruce Smith. Here's to restoring enthusiasm in history for kids and adults too.